Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Why does it feel like the world is quietly waiting for something to happen? I don't mean the big things, events you can see coming, the natural flow of life, but the small moments. The ones that seem insignificant but somehow lead you to where you never expected to be. It all began with an old book. It had been gathering dust in my attic for years, one of those things you forget about until curiosity nudges you to take a look. I hadn't thought much of it at first. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, the title barely visible. I remember the moment I found it. The faint smell of old paper filled the air as I brushed the dust off. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another relic from a past long forgotten. But then I opened it. The first few pages were filled with neat, elegant handwriting, but it wasn't the words that caught my attention. It was the page at the very end, tucked into the back. It was folded slightly, as if it had been hidden on purpose, kept separate from everything else. Something about it drew me in, a pull I couldn't ignore. I hesitated, the unsettling thought crawling in the back of my mind. Why was this page different from the rest? I unfolded it carefully, the paper cracking in protest, and stared at what was written. The ink was a dark, almost unnatural shade, as if it had been written under some strange light. But it wasn't the writing that chilled me, it was the words themselves. Tomorrow, at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you will hear a knock at your door. The person who knocks will not be who they seem. They will speak to you as if they know you. They will know things you don't remember telling them. They will offer you something you cannot refuse, and once you accept, you will never be the same again. I blinked. I read it again. And again. This is impossible, I thought. There was no way this could be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke. But why did my heart race with the unmistakable feeling that something terrible was about to happen? The more I stared at those words, the more they seemed to be alive, whispering to me. I put the page down, a chill running down my spine. The attic suddenly felt colder. And darker. The dim light coming through the dusty window was no longer comforting, it felt like a threat. The walls seemed to shrink in, closing in on me, like they were listening, waiting for the inevitable. No. It's just a page in a stupid book. It's not real. It's not real. I tried to shake the feeling, but the words on that page wouldn't leave me. I tucked the page back into the book, slamming it shut with a little more force than necessary. The unsettling silence that followed made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The house was old, and there were always creaks and groans, but this felt different. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second dragging by. Tick. 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 I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the hallway was empty. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to convince myself that this was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I opened them again, the feeling didn't go away. It had only grown stronger. There was a noise, a soft, barely noticeable sound coming from the direction of the stairs. I froze. It was faint, but unmistakable, a scraping like fingernails against wood. I must be hearing things, I told myself. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 1 in the afternoon. But something didn't sit right. The hair on my arm stood up. I couldn't explain it, but there was a presence in the room now, something hovering just at the edge of my awareness. I turned, half expecting to find someone behind me, but there was nothing. I stood up, my legs shaky, and made my way toward the stairs. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced by a low, muffled thud, like something heavy being dropped. I reached the staircase. Nothing was out of place. The silence returned, thicker than before, as if the house had swallowed the noise completely. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It was only a flicker, but it moved. And it was wrong. It didn't belong in the space. It was too sharp, too deliberate. A silhouette that didn't make sense. My breath caught. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was happening. Something was about to happen. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was tied to that page, the one with the prophecy. The one that spoke of tomorrow at 3 o'clock. The clock ticked again. The scrape of nails against wood returned, louder this time. Closer. I spun around, heart racing. There was nothing. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Someone was behind me. And I wasn't ready for it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, frozen in place, every sense alert. The silence in the house had become so profound, it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing against me. The scrape of nails on wood had stopped, but I could still feel the weight of its presence, lingering just out of sight. My heart raced. My breath quickened. I felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the room itself was warping around me. The familiar surroundings, the staircase, the old wooden floors, the faded wallpaper, were no longer comforting. They seemed foreign, unsettling, as if they too were aware of the presence in the house. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, each one echoing loudly in the silence. I had to know. What was it? What was I hearing? I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to face the hallway. The air smelled stale, the familiar scent of dust now thick and almost suffocating. The faint noise of the scraping had returned, but now it was followed by a low, guttural sound. It was like the house itself was groaning in pain. It's nothing, I told myself. I'm just imagining things. But then I saw it again, the shadow. It was moving along the hallway, but not like a normal shadow. It flickered and shifted, as though it were alive, as if it could change shape at will. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something more, something darker, with eyes that didn't belong to any living creature. I blinked, and it was gone. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do, where to go. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing felt real anymore. I glanced at the clock again. It was almost 2:30. The time was drawing nearer. 3 o'clock. The knock. The person who wouldn't be who they seemed. The feeling of being watched intensified, like a pressure on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I turned quickly, my back to the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing, but the unease remained, creeping up my spine like a slow-burning fire. Then I heard it again. A faint knock. It came from the door. Soft, tentative, as if it was unsure whether it should be heard. I froze. My entire body went rigid. My thoughts scattered. The page. The prophecy. It was happening. Right now. I approached the door slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. My throat tightened. The air was thick with anticipation. Every step I took felt like it was echoing louder and louder in my mind. I had no idea what would be on the other side, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't ready for this. The knock came again, louder this time. My breath caught in my throat. The door was heavy under my hand, as though it were resisting, unwilling to open. But I had to know. I couldn't leave it like this. I pushed the door open just a crack, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered through the narrow gap, eyes straining in the dim light. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. Silent. I stepped back, confused, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. The knock had sounded real, hadn't it? I couldn't have imagined it. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the shadow, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. It was no longer flickering. It was moving slowly, purposefully, toward me. My breath caught. The shadow wasn't a shadow anymore. It had form. It was human-shaped, tall and thin, but its edges were blurred, like it didn't quite belong in this world. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. I took a step back, my body instinctively moving away from the dark figure. My hand shot out, grabbing the doorframe for support. The shadow stopped. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. The air between us felt charged, like the very fabric of reality was fraying. Then, the shadow spoke. Its voice was low, distorted, as if coming from deep underwater. It was almost a whisper, but it felt like it reverberated through my bones. "I'm here," it said. "I've been waiting." I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed for me to run, to get away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing in front of me. It wasn't just the way it looked that terrified me, it was the sense of knowing it exuded, as if it had been here all along, hidden in the dark corners of the house, watching me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. What was I supposed to say to this thing? It took a step forward. I flinched. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier. I could see it now, more clearly. Its features were indistinct, but there was something about the way it stood, poised yet unnerving. Something in its posture made it feel wrong, as if it didn't belong here. The clock struck 2:30. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, waiting, watching. My heart hammered in my chest. I thought of the page again, of the prophecy. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, the knock, the person who isn't who they seem. The shadow's lips barely moved as it spoke again, and the words that followed sent a cold shiver down my spine. "You're the one who will change everything. It's already begun." I stumbled backward, my mind spinning, trying to comprehend what was happening. This couldn't be real. It can't be real. But as the shadow stepped closer, the air around me thickened, pressing in like a heavy fog. My pulse raced as I struggled to breathe. It had already begun. I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me, as if they couldn't carry the weight of what was happening. The air in the room felt like it was closing in, thick with something heavy and oppressive. My mind struggled to grasp at any shred of logic, but nothing made sense. How could this be happening? How could something like this be real? The shadow, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It had form, purpose. And the words it spoke, they weren't just threats. They were warnings. Or maybe something worse, declarations. You're the one who will change everything. It's already begun. I couldn't breathe. The room felt as though it were suffocating me, the very walls pressing in. I turned my head to glance at the window, desperate for an escape, but all I saw was the growing darkness outside, the trees swaying unnaturally in the wind as if they too were listening. Watching. The shadow stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate. It felt like time itself was stretching, each second dragging out longer than the one before. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. My chest tightened as though something invisible was constricting it. Every inch it came closer made the space around me seem smaller, darker, more suffocating. What do you want? I finally managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even recognize the fear in it. It was primal, raw. The shadow didn't respond at first, just hovering a few feet away, its dark form flickering in and out of focus like it was struggling to stay intact. And then, as if it had all the time in the world, it spoke again, its voice like gravel grinding together. You will understand soon. Time is a construct, a lie. You are not meant to know this, but you must. You are part of something that has been written long before you. I shook my head, trying to fight the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm me. I could feel it then, an unsettling pulse in the air. It wasn't just the shadow that was wrong. The entire house felt wrong, like the very foundation beneath me was shifting, trembling with the weight of something ancient. I don't understand, I whispered, my voice shaking now, as though I could somehow convince myself that none of this was real. But it was. It was real. The shadow tilted its head slightly, as if it were studying me. Its form twisted, contorting in ways that didn't seem possible. Impossible. You will, it murmured, and its voice felt like it was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. Soon, you will. The book will show you. It always does. The book. My heart skipped a beat. The same book I had found hidden in the attic, the one with the strange, cryptic pages, was this part of the prophecy? Had I unknowingly become part of some twisted ritual? Was the book alive? My thoughts were spiraling out of control, each possibility more horrifying than the last. I glanced at the book, still lying on the table where I had left it, its pages now feeling like they were alive with the weight of everything they contained. But I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, like concrete. My throat felt tight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow took another step forward. I should have been running. I should have bolted for the door. But I couldn't move. Every inch closer it came, the more my mind fragmented. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from behind me, snapping me back into the present. The book, it was glowing. Faint at first, but then brighter, almost blinding. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest as the light flickered and pulsed with an unnatural energy. I stumbled back towards the table, my eyes wide. The shadow's form was still behind me, but it didn't move forward. Instead, it was watching, waiting, as if it were anticipating something. The book began to hum. The low sound reverberated through my chest, vibrating like 1,000 tiny whispers, each one clawing at my sanity. I reached out, trembling, my fingers hovering above it, unsure if I dared touch it. But it was too late. The pages turned on their own, as though invisible fingers were flipping through them, rapidly, too rapidly for me to comprehend. I tried to stop them, but my hands shook so violently that I couldn't hold them still. The words began to blur, each letter stretching and twisting into symbols I didn't understand. Then, one page stopped, flicking back into place, and I saw it. A drawing. It wasn't like any picture I had seen before. It was a distorted version of the house, the very house I was standing in, and there, in the center, was a figure. It was me. But it wasn't me. The face was twisted, pale, the eyes empty and black, staring directly at me. It was like I was staring into some darker, alternate version of myself, one that had been consumed by the darkness, by the shadow. A chill ran down my spine as I looked at the date written at the bottom of the page. Tomorrow. I felt sick, dizzy. The clock on the wall, which had been silent until then, suddenly chimed. 3 o'clock. I turned sharply, my eyes darting around the room. The shadow was gone, but the air still felt charged, the pulse still thrumming in the walls. And then I heard it. A faint knock. So quiet, so soft, it almost sounded like it was inside my mind. I turned to the door, my hands trembling. I knew what was coming. I had seen it. But no part of me was ready. The door creaked open on its own, just a crack. The dim light in the hallway filtered through, and I could see a shadow. No, not a shadow. A figure. A person. But something was wrong. So wrong. The knock had been a warning. A sign. But now, standing before me, was the beginning of something I couldn't escape. It had already begun. The figure in the doorway didn't move at first. It stood there, just a silhouette in the dim light, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands felt clammy. I could feel the book, still glowing faintly on the table, as though it were pulling at me, urging me to look back at it, to understand what was happening. The figure wasn't quite human, not entirely. There was something about the way it stood, too still, too quiet, that made my skin crawl. The light from the hallway barely illuminated its shape, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. For a moment, I thought I might scream, but the sound was stuck somewhere deep inside me, lodged in my chest like a heavy weight. Who are you? I forced the words out, my voice shaking, barely a whisper. I wasn't even sure if I wanted an answer, but I couldn't just stand there. I had to do something. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, slowly. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, like a shadow stretching across the room. As it took another step, the floor creaked underfoot, the sound jarring in the silence that had settled in the room. I couldn't see its face. There was something wrong with it, something obscured by the darkness surrounding it. But the more I stared, the more I realized there was no face. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been. It was as if the figure had no identity, no purpose other than to be here. Then, the room seemed to grow colder. The air thickened, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I felt my heartbeat racing in my chest, each pulse louder than the last. The knock from earlier, the faint, hollow sound from the door echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. I needed to move. I needed to run. But my legs wouldn't obey. The figure took another step, and this time I heard a sound. A voice, low and distorted, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't a language I recognized, but I understood it in some twisted, primal way. It was a warning. The page has been turned. You cannot stop it now. The words felt like they were inside my head, like they were crawling beneath my skin. I staggered backward, my legs finally giving way as I collapsed onto the floor. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could explain this, anything that could help me understand what was happening. The book. I had to look at the book. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I grabbed the book from the table. The pages had stopped moving, but I could feel the weight of it in my hands, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I flipped through the pages quickly, desperate to find something that could give me an answer, but everything I touched felt wrong, like I was pulling at threads that were already unraveling. And then I saw it. A page I hadn't noticed before, buried near the back. The words were written in a language I didn't understand, but they were clear enough in their intent. I didn't need to know the words to feel the chill that crept down my spine. This is the end of the beginning. The phrase sent a shiver through me. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, suffocating me. I wasn't just a part of this nightmare, I was the cause of it. The figure in the doorway, the glowing book, the shadow in the attic, it was all connected, all part of some twisted fate that I couldn't escape. I slammed the book shut, the force of it reverberating through the room, but the noise felt hollow, empty. The figure didn't move. It stood there, watching me, its presence pressing in on me like the walls of a tomb. And then, as if on cue, I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic knock. This time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the room, from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The room, my own room, felt different. The shadows had grown longer, more intense, stretching out like they were alive. The air had thickened, the walls closing in, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The edges of reality seemed to be bending, twisting in on themselves. And then I saw it. A figure, crouched low in the corner of the room, watching me with empty eyes. Its face was a grotesque distortion, a mixture of familiar features twisted into something unrecognizable, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with an intensity that froze me in place. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the figure began to stand, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring every moment. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The shadows were closing in, and the figure's presence filled every inch of the room. "You can't escape it," the voice in my head whispered again. "It's already begun. You're part of the story now." I reached out for the door, desperate to flee, but the room around me was shifting, changing. The door was gone. There was no escape. The figure moved closer, its shape becoming clearer, its form solidifying like it was made of darkness itself. I felt the pull, like gravity was working against me, dragging me toward it. And then, the world went silent. The knocking stopped. The whispers stopped. The figure stood still, its form frozen in place. And for the first time since it had all begun, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a realization so terrible that it stole the breath from my lungs. It's not over. It was just beginning. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was thick, like a weight pressing down on me, holding me in place. My legs trembled beneath me, and I could feel the sweat running down my back, yet I couldn't move. It was as though the very room was closing in on me, like the walls themselves were shifting, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. The figure in the corner didn't move. Its face, if you could even call it that, remained a blurry, contorted mess, but the longer I stared, the more I could feel it looking at me, studying me in a way that felt more invasive than anything I had ever known. I wanted to look away, to escape the grip of its unblinking stare, but I couldn't. The more I fought to tear my gaze from it, the more it held me. I wanted to scream, to do something, anything, but the air around me seemed to have frozen, and my voice was a mere whisper in the heavy, suffocating silence. The book, I thought, the thought breaking through the haze of panic in my mind. Somehow, my body responded to the command, moving without thinking, my hands shaking violently as I reached for the book again. The pages felt like they were burning in my hands, searing with a heat I couldn't explain. But I had to know. I had to understand what was happening to me, what had brought this figure into my life, and why everything around me had begun to unravel. The moment I opened the book, a cold wind seemed to rush through the room, and the lights flickered above me. The words on the page were blurred, but as I stared, they began to shift and morph, forming themselves into a legible sentence. It was as though the book was alive, its contents reacting to my fear. You cannot escape your fate. You will live through this over and over again until the page is finished. I stumbled back, the words crawling across my skin like insects, itching and burning at the same time. My breath caught in my throat as I read them again. The same chilling realization hit me. The book was my fate. I had opened it, and now there was no way out. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, closer, closer. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and saw that the figure had moved. No, it was more than moving. It was gliding across the floor, its long, thin limbs stretching unnaturally as it approached. I scrambled backward, my feet slipping on the wooden floor, my breath erratic and shallow. The figure's face, or lack thereof, was now mere inches from mine. I could feel its presence press against me like the weight of 1,000 eyes. There was no escape. But then, it spoke. The voice wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't the low, distorted whisper I had heard before. No, this was louder, clearer, more human. You did this, it said, its voice like nails scraping across a chalkboard. You opened the book. You wanted to know, didn't you? Now, you will live through it all. Forever. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the empty face, at the thing that had come to claim me, to drag me into whatever twisted world had been set in motion by my curiosity. My mind reeled, trying to understand how this could be happening, but nothing made sense. I reached for the book again, trembling as I opened it once more, desperate to find some way to stop the madness. But the pages were blank. Blank. There was nothing left. The book had consumed itself. It was done. The figure was now standing directly in front of me, and as it reached out, its long, spindly fingers brushed against my cheek, sending a shock of cold through my entire body. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable, for whatever fate awaited me. The room spun around me, the darkness swallowing everything whole. But then, something strange happened. The figure pulled back. It tilted its head, almost as if it were curious. The oppressive pressure in the room lightened for a fraction of a second. I dared to open my eyes, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker, a change, a glimpse of something else beneath its skin. Something almost human. Before I could react, the world around me warped, the walls bending, the floor tilting beneath me. A crack formed in the air, a sharp, jagged line that split the room in two. Through it, I could see another world, one that looked like my own, but twisted, distorted. The sky was dark, the trees were blackened, and the ground seemed to ripple like liquid. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as I felt myself being pulled toward it. The figure's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with an unnatural strength, dragging me toward the crack in reality. And then, I heard it, the sound of the pages flipping, the unmistakable sound of the book turning on its own. I looked back toward the table where I had left the book, but it was no longer there. It was in the air now, floating in front of me, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The pages turned faster and faster, the words forming and vanishing in a blur, until finally, the page stopped. It was the same page I had seen before. The one with the words that had foretold all of this. But now, there was something different. Something new. "You are the story now," the page read. "And it will never end." I felt my body freeze. The figure's grip tightened. There was no escape. The book had already claimed me. And as the world around me shattered, I realized one last horrifying truth. The story was never meant for me to survive. And now, I would live it forever. The darkness consumed everything. It started with a sound. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't a typical noise, like a ping or ring. It was something else. Something urgent. It was like a whisper, just faint enough to make you question if it was real. At first, I thought it was the wind, a gust, a branch scraping against the window. But no! It was coming from my phone. It was late, past midnight, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the screen. I had been scrolling mindlessly, like I always did before bed, when the signal hit. A sharp, static-like buzz vibrated through my hand, sending a cold shiver up my spine. It wasn't a typical notification. It wasn't a message or a call. Just static, then a strange rhythm. A pattern. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. I didn't understand it at first. My heart beat a little faster, but I brushed it off. It was probably just some glitch, some random malfunction with the phone. That's what I told myself. But the next night, it happened again. The same pattern, same strange feeling. This time, the signal lasted longer. I could almost hear something in the buzz. A voice. Or maybe my mind was playing tricks. I wanted to ignore it. But deep down, something about it didn't sit right with me. It was too deliberate. I put the phone down, turned off the screen, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come. Not that night. The room felt colder. The shadows seemed longer. I could swear I heard footsteps, faint but distinct, coming from the hallway. My eyes darted to the door, my breath catching in my throat. But no one was there. I wasn't alone in the house, but it felt like I was. The silence was thick, suffocating. A silence that was more than just the absence of sound. It was oppressive. Heavy. It felt as if something was waiting. The next day, the signal came again. This time, I didn't ignore it. I couldn't. It was there, and it was getting harder to pretend it wasn't real. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling as I unlocked it. The same buzz. The same rhythm. But this time, I could feel the panic bubbling in my chest. It was like someone was trying to get my attention. No, not just attention. It was as if they were trying to tell me something. something I didn't want to understand. I tried to convince myself that it was just a malfunction, a weird bug. But even as I whispered those words to myself, a part of me knew the truth. Whatever it wasn't just a glitch. It felt like a warning. I left my phone on the table and tried to distract myself with other things. A walk outside. A few hours spent at the local coffee shop. Anything to get my mind off the sensation that something was watching me. But when I returned home, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it had intensified. There was a smell in the air, something faint but unmistakable. A musty, metallic odor that made my stomach churn. I glanced around the room, but I couldn't find the source. And then, for a brief moment, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Just the shadows. Just the dark. The lights flickered. I jumped. And then, the phone buzzed again. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. This time, I could hear it clearer than ever before. Almost like a voice, distorted, muffled, but undeniably real. It was calling me. But who, or what, was on the other end? I couldn't ignore the buzzing anymore. It wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it was persistent. Every night, without fail. The same sequence, the same feeling of someone or something trying to reach me. It had become impossible to ignore. I was awake every night now, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the buzz to come. The worst part? I knew it would, and I had no idea how to stop it. The days blurred together. My phone was always within reach now. My fingers hovered over it, almost without thinking. I couldn't stop checking for the signal, couldn't stop listening for that haunting rhythm. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. It had become a constant companion. Every time it vibrated, my heart skipped a beat. I had stopped answering it. Stopped checking the messages. But the signal kept coming, like a pulse, each time more insistent. As though it was trying to communicate, to break through the noise, to make itself heard. I started to see things. At first, it was nothing, shadows in the corner of my vision, quick flashes of movement just out of reach. But it wasn't just the shadows anymore. It was the feeling that something was there, watching me. Even in the bright light of day, it lingered, like a dark cloud over my every thought. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It was filled with sounds. The floorboards creaked. The wind rattled the windows, sounding like whispers. But there was something more to it. The whispers didn't just come from outside. They were inside the walls, hidden in the hum of the electrical wires, in the soft vibrations of the pipes. I couldn't escape it. I had to go out. I had to see if maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. So, I drove to the park. The one near the forest. I thought maybe the fresh air would clear my head. Maybe the sounds would stop if I just got away for a while. But as I sat on the bench, breathing in the cold night air, it happened again. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it. The signal was there, like it always was. But this time, something was different. It wasn't just the usual pattern. There was a message. A string of numbers, foreign and distorted. I stared at it. The numbers didn't make sense. But they were familiar, like something I had seen before, somewhere in the back of my mind. It was as if they were meant to trigger something, like a forgotten memory trying to force its way to the surface. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the phone. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to warp around me, bending and stretching. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was standing right behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I was alone. Or was I? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A chill ran through me. The trees around the park rustled, but the wind had died down. The air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Don't look. That thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. Don't look. But my head turned. It was instinct. I couldn't stop it. There, just beyond the tree line, in the shadows of the forest, I saw it. A figure. A person, standing completely still. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was impossible to make out any details, just the vague shape of a figure, tall and thin, cloaked in darkness. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes. I could feel it watching me. The hair on my arms prickled. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, my voice stolen. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, like a flash, the figure disappeared. Vanished into the shadows, as though it had never been there. I blinked, and the park was quiet again. Too quiet. I stood up, almost stumbling, my mind racing. Was it real? Was I seeing things? Had the stress and the signals finally cracked something inside of me? I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. I turned toward the path leading home, but the moment I did, I heard it. The buzz. The signal. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. I checked my phone again, my hands shaking. The same message, the same numbers. But this time, there was something new. A location. Coordinates. I couldn't breathe. I knew exactly where it led. It led to the forest. But why? Who was sending me this? And why now? I couldn't move. The phone felt heavier than ever in my hands. The coordinates on the screen were clear, too clear. They pointed to the very place I had just seen the figure, just beyond the trees, where the shadows felt thick enough to swallow you whole. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the phone clutched tightly in my palm. The buzzing from my device was no longer just a disturbance, it had become a constant presence, a reminder that I couldn't escape this. That this was real. And somehow, it was waiting for me. I didn't want to go back to the forest. I didn't want to follow those coordinates. But my feet were moving before I could even think about it. It was as if some unseen force was pulling me, guiding me toward whatever was out there. The walk to the forest was agonizingly slow. Each step felt heavy, like the ground was pushing back against me, reluctant to let me leave the safety of the road. The darkness around me thickened, and the streetlights flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. When I reached the edge of the forest, I stopped. The air was colder here. The trees, once familiar, now looked like towering sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out, as if trying to grab me. I could hear the rustling of leaves, but it was more than just the wind. It sounded like whispers, soft, fleeting voices that echoed in the distance. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. I took a shaky breath. My phone buzzed again, and I instinctively glanced at it. Another message. But this time, it wasn't just numbers. There were words. Come closer. I could feel my pulse quicken. It was no longer just an eerie signal from an unknown source. It was a demand. Something, or someone, was reaching out to me, pulling me closer with each passing second. I looked up at the dark expanse of the forest. The shadows seemed to be alive now, shifting and moving with a life of their own. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to go back. But my legs wouldn't listen. They carried me forward, step by step, deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, denser, with each step. The whispers were louder now. Not just voices, but words, snippets of phrases that I couldn't quite make out. The closer I got to the forest's heart, the clearer the whispers became. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the buzzing came again. It was coming from the forest. From within the trees. I froze. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. I followed the sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer, more defined as I approached. I was standing at the edge of a small clearing now. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting long, jagged shadows on the ground. In the center of the clearing stood a stone structure, old and weathered, with carvings that looked ancient, almost alive, like they were pulsing with energy. The buzzing came from somewhere deep inside the structure, and now it felt like it was inside my head, rattling my thoughts, distorting my vision. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the signal stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear my own breath, shaky and uneven. I was standing just outside the structure now, the eerie markings on the stones gleaming faintly in the moonlight. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the center of the structure, illuminated by the dim light. It was the same figure from the park, the one I had seen just beyond the trees. But now it was clearer. More solid. Its features were blurred, like an unfinished sketch, a shape that wasn't quite human but still close enough to make you question if you were seeing things. The eyes were the worst part. They were empty, just dark pits staring at me, waiting. Come closer. The words weren't just in my head anymore. They were coming from the figure, a low, rasping voice that sent a chill crawling down my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My feet were frozen in place, my body betraying me as I stared at it, unable to turn away. It reached out toward me, its hands unnaturally long, fingers curling like twisted branches. And then, as if someone flipped a switch, the world around me shifted. The trees, the ground, the air, all of it seemed to warp, twist, and bend. The forest around me was no longer the place I had walked into. The familiar trees now looked like giants, their trunks gnarled and monstrous. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, hunting me. The buzzing started again. Louder now, deafening. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. It was coming from all directions, surrounding me, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The figure spoke again. You're too late. The ground beneath me trembled, and I stumbled backward. But I couldn't move fast enough. Something was coming. Something was rising from the depths of the earth. The forest was alive now, its roots shifting beneath my feet like they had a mind of their own. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, but I could feel it. The presence. The thing that had been watching me. That had been waiting for me. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to stop until it had me. My feet pounded against the uneven forest floor as I ran, branches snapping underfoot, the night air cold and thick in my lungs. The further I went, the harder it became to see, the shadows closing in like a blanket, suffocating and oppressive. My heart was hammering in my chest, my mind racing, but nothing felt real anymore. It was as if I had stepped into a nightmare where nothing made sense, and no matter how fast I ran, the nightmare was always just behind me, following my every step. The buzzing had stopped, but its presence lingered like a constant, unshakable hum beneath my skin. I could feel it. Something was out there, hunting me. The darkness of the forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, each step I took dragging me deeper into it, deeper into whatever this was. I wanted to scream, to call for help. But the words caught in my throat, stuck there, as if the very air was thickening, blocking the sound from escaping. All I could hear was the pounding of my own feet, the frantic beat of my heart, and the occasional snap of a twig as someone moved through the woods with me, just out of sight. The moonlight barely reached the ground, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift with every glance. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it, the figure, following me, its dark eyes fixed on me, but there was nothing. Only the endless stretch of trees and darkness. I rounded a bend and stumbled, falling to my hands and knees, the ground scraping against my palms. For a moment, I just knelt there, gasping for air, feeling the cold earth beneath me, trying to calm my panicked breathing. Then I heard it. The footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Too close. I didn't have time to think. I pushed myself up, ignoring the sharp sting in my knees as I broke into another desperate run, faster now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. The trees loomed above me like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out to grab me. I tried not to look at them, tried not to let my fear get the best of me, but the sensation of something watching me grew stronger with every step. It's getting closer. I didn't dare glance behind me. I knew, deep down, if I did, it would be there. But I had no choice. My breath was ragged, my legs burning with exhaustion, and every part of me screamed to stop. But I couldn't. I had to escape. A sudden flash of movement caught my eye. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there, just the darkness, the trees, the shadows. But the sense of something out of place lingered. The whisper of a voice, low and distorted, rose in the back of my mind. You can't run forever. I froze mid-step. The voice wasn't coming from behind me anymore, it was coming from inside my head. I could hear it clearly now, as if it had been following me all along, whispering to me, pulling at the edges of my sanity. A crack echoed through the night, louder than anything I had ever heard, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving quickly through the trees, branches snapping, leaves rustling. It was chasing me. I could feel it. I bolted forward again, my legs trembling beneath me, my mind barely able to keep up with the frantic pace of my body. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees now pressing together, their gnarled roots reaching up like hands desperate to drag me back into the earth. A distant rumble shook the ground beneath me. The air felt charged, electric, like the storm was already here, even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I glanced to the side, and there it was. The figure. It was standing in the middle of the path, just ahead, its silhouette barely visible against the inky blackness of the woods. but I could feel its eyes watching me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, waiting. It's waiting for you. I stumbled to a halt, my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped. The figure was blocking the path. I was cornered. Then, just as I was about to turn and find another way, the buzzing returned. Louder. More intense. BZZT, pause, BZZT, pause, BZZT. It was coming from the figure. The distortion of sound warping and twisting, like it was coming from deep within its body. My fingers twitched, reaching for my phone, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. The message on the screen flickered to life again, the same eerie string of numbers and symbols, and then more words. It's too late to escape. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and finally, I backed away, step by slow step, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen. My body wouldn't obey. The world seemed to tilt and shift, and then I saw it, movement behind the figure. Something else. A shadow. No, not just a shadow, a form rising up from the ground. A shape. A shape that was wrong. Twisted. Contorted. I felt the world spin around me, everything blurring and twisting as I realized what was happening. The forest wasn't just a place. It was part of it. Part of whatever was calling me here. I wasn't in control anymore. I wasn't alone. Before I could react, the figure moved too fast. A flash of black, reaching for me. I turned and ran. And this time, I didn't stop. I didn't know how long I had been running. The night had swallowed me whole, and I could no longer tell if I was moving through the forest or through some strange, shifting version of reality. My feet barely touched the ground, and my heart pounded like a drum in my chest, each beat reverberating in my skull. I had to stop. I had to rest. But every time I slowed, the buzzing in my ears grew louder, more insistent, like an electrical storm rising inside my head. I couldn't escape it. There was no way out. The woods stretched endlessly, as if they were growing around me, closing me in. I stumbled through the darkness, blindly reaching for something to hold onto, anything to steady myself. The trees here weren't like the others. Their bark was twisted, almost black, and the leaves had a strange, unnatural sheen. I could feel their presence, the weight of their ancient, malevolent energy pressing against my skin. And then, I heard it again. A low, distorted laugh. It sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the figure anymore. Whatever it was, it had followed me here, and now it was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anything in the dark. I spun around, panic rising in my chest, but the clearing I had just entered seemed different. The trees were closer now, as if the forest had moved in on me. The space was smaller, the air thicker, heavier, like it was filled with something unseen. A presence. I glanced down at my phone, the screen still flickering, the words still flashing. Come closer. They were the same as before, but now there was something new. A message that hadn't been there before. You shouldn't have come back. I felt the weight of the message press against me. Something inside me twisted. It was as though my mind and body were betraying me, pulling me back towards something I didn't want to understand. I turned, moving away from the trees, trying to make sense of what was happening. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. Every part of me screamed for an answer, but the more I searched for it, the further it slipped away, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. I thought I heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, behind me. But when I spun around, there was nothing. Nothing but the silence, the thick, choking silence that clung to the air. And then, out of nowhere, it happened. The ground beneath me shifted. It was subtle at first, like the earth was breathing, expanding and contracting. But it grew stronger, faster. I staggered backward as the ground cracked open, a deep, guttural sound filling the air. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat. Something rose from the crack in the earth, its shape shifting, writhing, like a living mass of shadows and nightmares. It was so large, I couldn't see all of it, only flashes of movement, of something too terrible to comprehend. The air turned cold, suffocating, as the shape took form, a towering figure, taller than anything I could imagine, its body like an unfinished sketch, parts of it dissolving into the shadows, others forming into twisted limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, my thoughts a blur. It was the figure, the one from the park, the one from the clearing. But now, it wasn't just an empty shape. It had become something else. Something darker, more powerful. And the buzzing. It was deafening now, coming from everywhere. Inside my skull, in the trees, from the earth beneath me. It was the sound of something alive, and it was calling to me, reaching for me. The voice came again, low and almost familiar, echoing in my mind. You're part of this now. The words made no sense. They were like fragments of a shattered reality. But they felt true. They felt real. The very air around me seemed to pulse with the truth of it. I turned and ran again, my body moving on its own, fueled by nothing but raw terror. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted through the dark forest, but every turn felt wrong, like the trees themselves were shifting, changing the path. It was like the forest was alive and aware of me. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches scraping against my skin, their leaves rustling with whispers that weren't my own. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, this time not behind me, but in front. I couldn't stop. My legs burned, my breath was ragged, but I kept running. Until I saw the light. A flicker in the distance. It was faint at first, barely visible, but it was there. A beacon. I stumbled toward it, my eyes wide, desperate for anything familiar. It was a house, an old cabin, the kind you'd see in an abandoned part of the woods. Its windows were dark, but the light in the distance seemed to be coming from inside. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. The door opened with a soft creak, and I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, musty, but it was quiet. It felt safe. For a moment, I thought I was finally alone, that I had escaped. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls, covered in symbols. Symbols I had seen before. On the structure in the forest. I had been here before. It was late when I heard the sound. A light scrape, faint but unmistakable, from the basement. I stood still for a moment, listening. Maybe it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans that come with an old building. But then it came again. A soft shuffle. Someone, something, was down there. I lived alone. Or at least, I thought I did. My house wasn't much. A small two-story place on the outskirts of town, quiet and far enough from the busy streets to feel isolated, but close enough to the grocery store that I didn't mind the walk. I had always found it comforting until tonight. I took a step back, my mind racing. The basement door was right there at the end of the hallway, just a few feet from where I stood, its wooden surface shadowed in the dim light of the upstairs hallway. The thought of going down there sent a chill down my spine. But curiosity had always been a part of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was down there, waiting. The basement had always felt off. I couldn't explain it, but there was something in the air, something wrong. The stairs creaked underfoot when I climbed down, and the air smelled musty, like old newspapers and damp stone. But I had never thought much about it. It was just part of the house. Until tonight. I glanced at my phone. It was almost 3 a.m. The whole house was dark and still, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the sound of my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. I knew I should leave it alone, that it was probably just my imagination. But I couldn't. Slowly, I approached the basement door, my fingers brushing the cool handle. I held my breath as I turned it. The door creaked open, and the cold air from below hit me like a wave. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, the light from the hallway barely illuminating the first few steps. The stairs were steep, and the railing was loose, but I made my way down anyway. With each step, the air grew colder, and the smell of dust grew thicker, almost suffocating. I reached the bottom and switched on the basement light. The bare bulb flickered before settling into a steady glow, revealing the concrete floor and wooden shelves that lined the walls. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing at all. But then I saw it. There, in the dust on the floor, were 2 distinct footprints. They were fresh, too fresh to have been there for long. The edges of the prints were sharp, not yet faded by time. I bent down to get a closer look, my heart pounding in my chest. They were too large to be mine. They weren't shoes either, at least, not the kind I was familiar with. The shape was odd, almost like a combination of a boot and a bare foot, the toes too elongated, the heels too deep in the dust. I could make out every detail, the pattern of the heel, the faint outlines of the arch. I stood up quickly, my stomach turning. The feeling of unease that had been building all night hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone in the house, but I had to know more. I followed the footprints, moving further into the basement. The air was thick, and the faint smell of something sour lingered in the corners. The prints led to the farthest corner of the basement, near a stack of old boxes. I stopped in my tracks when I saw it. A shadow moving against the wall. It wasn't just a trick of the light. I saw it, clear as day. It was tall, impossibly tall, its edges blurry, like it was made from smoke or mist. It shifted, stretching and twisting, as if it were aware of me, aware that I was watching. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow seemed to move towards me, its form becoming more defined with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, my limbs frozen in place. I could hear the soft scrape of its movement, just like the noise I had heard earlier, but now it was unmistakably real. I wanted to run, to scream, to get away, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if the air had turned to concrete, holding me in place. The shadow stopped, just a few feet away from me. I could feel its presence, cold and unnatural. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I wanted to ask what it was, why it was here, but the fear in my chest was so thick, so heavy, that I couldn't form the words. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow receded. It was gone. The basement was silent once more. The footprints in the dust remained untouched. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I tried to grasp what had just happened. Was it real? Was it my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know. But one thing was certain, the basement would never be the same again. I turned and rushed back up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it hadn't left. It was still down there, waiting. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I heard it. A soft shuffle, coming from the basement. And this time, it wasn't alone. I stood frozen in front of the basement door, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound had stopped, but the unease didn't. It lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, like something unseen was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I pressed my back against the door, my hands trembling as I gripped the knob, as if somehow holding on might give me control over the terror that had taken root in my gut. I glanced around the hallway, the dim light from the upstairs spilling across the floor in pale pools. The house seemed different now, somehow. The familiar creaks of the old floorboards, the faint ticking of the clock from the living room, all of it felt distant, like it was coming from another world entirely. I could feel my mind straining against the fear, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that it had all been some kind of hallucination. But the footprints, the shadow, the scrape from below, it wasn't in my head. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew I had to do next. The basement door loomed in front of me like an ominous gate to a place I shouldn't be. But I couldn't just leave it. Not now. Not after seeing what I had seen. I had to know what was down there. With a shaky hand, I turned the knob and pushed the door open again, the same musty air rushing up to greet me. This time, the light from the hallway didn't seem to reach as far into the basement. It felt like the shadows stretched further, curling in on themselves, swallowing up the corners of the room. I stepped into the darkness, my breath shallow. The basement stairs creaked beneath my feet, each step sending a jolt of fear through my spine. I glanced over my shoulder at the door, half expecting something to be standing there, watching me, but it was just the same empty hallway behind me. The basement was unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds, the hum of the furnace, the occasional dripping from the pipes, were gone. It was as if the whole house had held its breath, waiting. I reached the bottom of the stairs and clicked on the light again. The bulb flickered weakly before illuminating the cold concrete floor. The dust still lay undisturbed, save for the two strange footprints that were now unmistakable, no longer just a trick of the light or my imagination. They were real, and they were leading further into the room. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move forward, my feet dragging across the floor. I tried not to look at the footprints, tried to ignore the way the air seemed to press in on me from all sides. But I couldn't. I couldn't look away from them. It was like they were pulling me forward, like they wanted me to follow them. Then I heard it. A soft, raspy breath, inhale, exhale, coming from somewhere in the shadows. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. No, this was different. This was something else. I strained my ears, listening, trying to make sense of the sound. It was faint, barely perceptible over the pounding of my own heart. But it was there. There was no mistaking it. I swallowed hard and took a step closer. The light above me flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls, distorting the corners of the room. For a split second, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A figure. Tall, dark, like a silhouette made of shadow. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing there. Just the dim glow of the light and the creeping darkness. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The breathing, slow, deliberate, grew louder, echoing through the basement like it was coming from all around me. It felt like it was inside my head, inside my very soul, and I couldn't escape it. I didn't know what it was, but I knew, deep down, that it was not human. I took another step, my eyes scanning the basement, trying to see through the darkness. The shadows seemed to stretch out before me, as if they were alive, twisting and bending. The strange footprints led me to the far corner, near the old wooden shelves I had avoided for years. They had always been a jumble of forgotten boxes, broken furniture, and old tools, nothing of importance. But now, they looked different. More ominous. I moved closer, drawn by an invisible force, my feet dragging in the dust. The sound of breathing was louder now, closer, almost right behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I reached the shelves and stared into the dark space between them. It was hard to see, but I could make out something in the corner, something small and white. A piece of paper? A note? I stepped forward, my heart racing. As my hand reached out, something cold brushed against my wrist. My body went stiff, and I almost jumped out of my skin. I spun around, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But again, there was nothing there. Nothing but the breathing. I grabbed the paper, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The writing was smudged, like it had been wet at some point, but I could still make out the words. Leave before it's too late. It's already watching you. My stomach twisted, and I felt my pulse quicken. There was no name, no sign of who had left it. Just those words, hanging in the air like a warning, like a curse. Before I could process it, I heard the sound again, a shuffle, slow but deliberate. And this time, it was louder. Closer. I snapped my head to the side, my eyes darting to the shadows, to the corners of the room. I had to get out. I had to. Suddenly, I saw it. A figure, tall and twisted, standing just beyond the light, its face a blur of shifting shapes. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, pinpricks of light. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was a whisper, a rasp, like something long buried beneath the earth. Leave now. The words scraped across my mind, a cold shiver running down my spine. It didn't move, didn't make a sound as it stood there, watching. I turned and ran, the paper slipping from my fingers as I bolted toward the stairs. My heart was pounding, and my breath was coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. I reached the door at the top of the stairs and slammed it shut behind me, gasping for air. The sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable, echoed from below. And I realized, with growing terror, that it wasn't just watching me. It was following me. I stood at the top of the stairs, my body trembling uncontrollably, the cold sweat on my skin clinging to my clothes. My breath was shallow, ragged, and every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, to leave the house, to escape whatever was lurking below. But I couldn't. I couldn't just leave. There was something in me, a need to understand, to know what I was dealing with. The basement door creaked as it slowly began to swing open by itself, like some invisible hand was pushing it. The faint glow of the light below flickered, then went out completely, leaving nothing but the suffocating darkness. I glanced around the hallway, the dim light from upstairs doing little to calm the fear that gripped me. The house was silent now, unnaturally so. Not even the creaks of the floorboards or the rustle of the wind outside. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that made you feel like something was waiting just beyond the edge of your sight. The paper I had dropped on the floor downstairs, the warning flashed through my mind. It's already watching you. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It was just a note written by someone, probably a prank or an old resident who had left it behind in a moment of paranoia. But as I thought about the figure I had seen in the basement, its glowing eyes, the way it had spoken, I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend it wasn't real. Something was wrong with the house. Something was watching me. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but my hands were still shaking so violently that I could barely unlock the screen. I cursed under my breath. What good would it do to call the police? They wouldn't believe me. I could barely believe it myself. Then I heard it again. A soft shuffle from downstairs, the unmistakable sound of footsteps dragging across the floor. It was so faint, I almost thought I imagined it, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up and a cold chill ran down my spine. The sound was coming closer. My breath hitched and I glanced over at the door to the basement. It stood slightly ajar, the darkness behind it so thick it seemed to swallow the light from upstairs. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, like someone or something was taking its time, moving slowly but purposefully up the stairs. I backed away, my feet stumbling as I tried to distance myself from the source of the noise. I knew I needed to leave, but I couldn't. There was no escape. The house felt smaller now, its walls closing in on me, its silence oppressive and suffocating. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, thicker, until it was hard to breathe. I could almost feel the weight of the presence in the house, whatever it was, whatever it had become. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I froze. It wasn't a person. The steps were too uneven, too disjointed. And now I could hear the faint scraping sound again, like something dragging across the floor. It was closer now, much closer. My mind raced. I thought about the note again, the warning, it's already watching you. But it was more than that now. It wasn't just watching. It was here. In my house. It was no longer a question of if, but when it would reveal itself. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I was frozen, my entire body stiff with fear. I strained to hear any hint of movement, any sign that whatever it was still there, but all I could hear was my own pounding heartbeat. Then, from behind the door, I heard a whisper. It was so soft at first, so faint, I almost thought I imagined it. But no, it was real. Leave. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that belonged to this world. I stepped back, my mind going blank, fighting the urge to scream, to run. But before I could move, the door creaked open fully, revealing the darkened basement beyond. And standing in the threshold, just beyond the edge of the light, was the figure again. It was tall, so tall that its head nearly brushed the top of the doorframe. Its limbs were unnaturally long, twisted at angles, and its skin seemed to shimmer with an eerie, translucent quality, like it wasn't entirely there. The face was still a blur, shifting between shapes, never fully taking form, but I could see its eyes, bright, glowing spots in the darkness, like two tiny lanterns in the pitch black. The figure took a step forward. My heart nearly stopped. It wasn't moving like a person. Its movements were slow and jerky, like it was still adjusting to the space, to the world it was occupying. The dragging sound continued with every movement, as if something was scraping against the floor with each step. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, paralyzed with terror. The figure was moving closer now, its shape growing more distinct, though it still felt like something out of a nightmare. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice wasn't just one voice. It was multiple, layered, like a chorus of whispers all blending together into a single, horrible sound. It reverberated in my skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I turned and ran. My feet flew across the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know what I was running from. All I could think about was getting away from it, getting as far away as possible. But the house was wrong. The walls seemed to shift as I ran, the hallway stretching longer and longer. I couldn't see the end. No matter how much I ran, it felt like the hallway was pulling me back toward the basement. Toward that thing. I stumbled, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned down another hallway, desperate to escape. But the footsteps were behind me. Slow, deliberate, dragging closer with every passing second. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it, closer now, right behind me, the dragging steps echoing in the hall, each one a cold reminder of what was following me. My lungs burned as I pushed myself faster, my legs carrying me as if by some instinct, despite the panic threatening to overtake me. Every corner I turned only seemed to make the house grow larger, more labyrinthine, until I couldn't tell if I was even moving in the right direction anymore. The house had never felt so vast, yet suffocatingly small at the same time. The floorboards creaked under my feet with each hurried step, their sound mingling with the faint rustling and the thudding of my pulse. The darkness stretched out before me, swallowing the light from the hallway. The air grew thicker, the suffocating silence pressing against me, and I could feel the temperature dropping, the chill seeping through my skin. The house wasn't just alive, it was breathing. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to listen, to turn around. But I couldn't. The thing behind me was too close. I could hear it, breathing softly now, its presence enveloping the space around me. I dared to glance over my shoulder. Nothing. The hallway behind me was empty. The shadows were long, stretching far into the dark, but there was no figure. No creature. My heart stopped for a moment, the silence that followed feeling heavier than ever. It was as if the very air had frozen in place. But then I heard it. A whisper. So faint, I almost missed it. "You can't escape." The voice, no, the voices, came from all around me. They crawled under my skin, filling my ears, my mind, making it impossible to think, impossible to focus. They twisted around me like invisible hands, tightening their grip with every passing second. I stumbled, panic clawing at my throat as I tried to run faster, but the house seemed to shift again. The walls, once solid and familiar, now seemed to close in on me. The hallways stretched and contracted, the doorways distorting as if the very architecture of the house was alive, then untrapping me within its depths. The breathing was louder now. A soft, rasping sound. It was everywhere. I could feel its weight, whatever it was, pressing down on me, pulling the air from my lungs. The walls seemed to pulse, the darkness pressing tighter, as though the house itself was closing its grip on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could barely move. And then I heard something else. A creak. Not from the floor, but from above. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, hanging upside down from the ceiling. It was like the shadows themselves had come alive, twisting into the shape of a human form. Its arms were unnaturally long, bent at impossible angles, and its face, if you could even call it a face, was a shifting blur of darkness, only two glowing eyes visible in the void. The thing was grinning, or at least, it felt like it was grinning. A terrible, empty smile that filled me with dread. I screamed, but the sound died in my throat as quickly as it left my lips. The air around me was too thick. The walls were closing in faster now, and my feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, as if the very ground was trying to swallow me whole. I forced myself to move. I had to get out. There had to be a way out. There had to be an escape from this nightmare. I turned down another hallway, but it only led me back to where I started. I was trapped. There was no way out. This house, had become a maze, its walls shifting and warping around me. And then the whispering returned. Louder now, the voices crashing into my head, overlapping and becoming a deafening chorus of hissing sounds. Leave. It's too late. You can't hide. We're coming for you. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices had already invaded my mind, each word digging into my thoughts like a splinter. The figure above me shifted, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it began to crawl down the wall, its glowing eyes fixed on me, its grin widening. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, blindly. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many corners I turned, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed, that I was being hunted. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was alive. It was awake. And it wasn't going to let me leave. I reached the door at the end of the hallway. The front door. The one that led outside. I could see it just a few feet away. I was so close. My hands fumbled for the handle, my heart racing as I tried to twist it open, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I pounded on it, shouting, banging my fists against the wood, but the sound was muffled, like the house was swallowing the noise, like it didn't want me to escape. The door wouldn't open. The walls began to press in tighter. The creature was there, just behind me. I could feel its presence, its cold, hungry gaze burning into my back. I couldn't hear the breathing anymore. I didn't need to. The house was silent again. The walls were closing in. The shadows had become too thick to see. I backed away from the door, panicking. The creature was almost upon me now. I could hear it, its breath hot against my neck. I didn't know what it wanted, what it was. But I knew one thing. It wasn't going to stop until it had me. The walls were closing in, pushing me to the edge of sanity. The air grew even thicker, suffocating, as if the house was alive, its heart beating in rhythm with my frantic pulse. Each breath felt like it might be my last, every second stretching out, taunting me with the certainty that escape was impossible. The creature's presence was undeniable now. It was everywhere, crawling through the very fabric of the house, its hunger palpable, its eyes never leaving me. I turned back toward the door. still locked. The wood beneath my fingers was smooth, unyielding, a mocking reminder that no matter how hard I tried, I was never going to leave. The creature had won. It had already taken hold of this place, and now it was taking me too. The sound of its movement grew louder, the scraping of its limbs against the walls like claws on glass, sending a shiver down my spine. I could almost feel the weight of its gaze, even though I couldn't bring myself to look. I knew better. I knew that to look would be to fall deeper into its trap. I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering started again, louder this time, the voices distorting into one, blending into a single, hollow chant that filled my mind. You belong here. You're ours now. There's no way out. It was too much. Too much to hear. Too much to feel. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to drown out the voices, but they still clawed at me, digging deeper into my mind, pulling at my very soul. My heart pounded, my legs shaking with fear. The house was alive. It was breathing, it was feeding, and it wanted me. The floor creaked beneath me, the sound sharp and sudden, snapping me out of my trance. I looked down, my eyes darting to the floor beneath my feet, where the faintest outline of a shape appeared. It was small at first, almost too faint to see, a set of footprints leading from the shadows at the far end of the hall to where I stood. I froze. I had never seen them before. They weren't mine. The footsteps were too small, too delicate. The edges were soft, faded, as though they had been made long ago and were only now revealing themselves. But they weren't old. No, they were fresh. Wet. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The footprints were leading directly toward me, as if whatever had made them was walking straight toward me, step by step. I backed away, my pulse quickening. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat, frozen by terror. There was no time. There was no escape. The door wouldn't open, the hallway was a maze, and the creature, whatever it was still out there, waiting. And then I saw it. The source of the footsteps. It was a figure, emerging slowly from the dark. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could even begin to describe. It was an amalgamation of shadows, moving with a strange, jerky motion, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was a void, a shifting blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its eyes, two glowing orbs, burned into mine, filling me with a cold, paralyzing fear. It didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to drain the very life from me. I could feel my body moving before I even realized it, my legs carrying me back, stumbling, tripping over my own feet. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. I needed to escape before it. The floor beneath me cracked. I fell. The world spun around me as I tumbled, hitting the cold, unforgiving concrete of the basement floor. Pain shot through my body, but it was distant, drowned out by the overwhelming sense of dread that filled me. The footsteps were closer now. They echoed in the dark, each step a thud against my chest, each one vibrating in my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my hands desperately searching for something, anything, to defend myself. But the basement was empty. There was nothing here. No weapons. No light. Only shadows. And then I saw it. A door. It was barely visible, half hidden by a pile of discarded furniture in the corner. I didn't care what it led to. I didn't care if it was the way out or another trap. I just needed to get through it, away from this thing. I sprinted toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the handle. It was cold. The door opened. And there, in the faint light beyond, I saw something I would never forget. A figure. Me. It was standing there, perfectly still, staring at me with those same glowing eyes. It wasn't me, but it looked like me. The same face, the same body, the same clothes. But there was something wrong about it. Something empty. I staggered back, my mind racing, my heart hammering in my chest. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. This was my mind, my fear, playing tricks on me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, a silent, knowing presence. Then it spoke. "You can't leave," it said, its voice a perfect echo of mine, hollow and cold. I felt something cold grip my chest, pulling me toward it. The darkness around me seemed to close in, swallowing everything, and then silence. Have you ever felt the weight of silence? Not the kind of silence you hear in a peaceful room, but the kind that presses against your chest, pushing the air from your lungs. The silence that feels alive, like it knows something you don't, something it's keeping from you. It all started a week ago when I first moved into this house. The kind of house that looks charming at first glance but feels wrong once you settle in. It's an old, creaky place on the outskirts of town. The kind of house that most people would overlook, but there was something about it that drew me in. Maybe it was the price, or maybe it was the isolation. Either way, I found myself standing at the door, keys in hand, with no one else around to hear my thoughts but the house itself. From the very first night, I felt it. A strange kind of stillness that wrapped itself around me like a suffocating blanket. It wasn't just the usual quiet you get when you live alone. It was something else. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. For what? I didn't know. But the longer I stayed, the more I became aware of it. It's hard to explain. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaks of an old house settling. A random thud here and there. But it wasn't. It was more than that. The silence itself felt off. It was too thick, too deep, like it was absorbing every sound around it, leaving only emptiness. Even the usual sounds of my own movements, footsteps on the hardwood, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed to be swallowed up. I tried to ignore it. It was easy to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, moving into a new place can be stressful, right? But as the days went on, the feeling only got worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. That something was watching me. The silence never broke. It was too quiet. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the house, just to get a better feel for it. Maybe the silence was just a part of its charm. The house was built in the 1920s, so I expected some quirks. But as I walked through the rooms, something odd caught my attention. The walls were too thick. I couldn't hear anything from the outside, not even the usual sounds of passing cars or distant voices. There were no birds singing, no wind rustling the trees. It was as though the entire world had been muffled, drowned by the walls of this house. I reached the kitchen, and that's when I first noticed it. The sound, or rather, the lack of it. I was standing by the window, looking out at the garden when a tiny noise, barely perceptible, caught my ear. It was a soft shuffle, like something, was moving just beyond the threshold of my vision. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but nothing. Nothing but the empty kitchen, the light flickering faintly above me. My breath caught in my throat. It was back. That feeling again. I wasn't alone. I walked to the back door, trying to shake off the paranoia creeping in, but before I could turn the knob, I heard it again. Another shuffle, this time closer, followed by a soft tapping sound, like fingernails against wood. I froze. In the back of my mind, a thought emerged. Maybe it was the house settling, or perhaps the pipes. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I could feel it, feel something lurking just out of reach, hiding in the corners of the house. I stepped back from the door, my pulse quickening. This was insane. I was being ridiculous. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching me, listening, waiting for me to unravel. But why? What did it want from me? I forced myself to calm down. It had to be my imagination. But the longer I stood there, the more certain I became that something was wrong. The silence was too deep, too thick, like it was hiding something I wasn't supposed to hear. A moment passed, and the silence returned, heavier now. It pressed against my chest, suffocating. I turned and walked away from the door, but not before I noticed a strange detail, the faintest set of footprints in the dust on the floor. They weren't mine. I was sure of it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic rising in my throat. But my mind couldn't shake the image of those footprints. It was just me in the house. So who? I swallowed hard, hoping the question would disappear. But it didn't. The silence deepened. The night that followed felt heavier than any before. I tried to sleep, but the silence clung to me as though it had settled into my very skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those footprints again, faint, almost as if they were created by something that didn't truly touch the ground. The faint tap of nails, the shuffle of something dragging its feet, and the thickening air. I couldn't shake it. The house had changed, and I was trapped in it. I woke up at 2:42 a.m., the digital clock beside my bed mocking me with its cold, unblinking stare. The house was as still as ever, but there was something different. I had learned over the past few days to listen to that stillness, to trust the nagging feeling that something was off. The room felt smaller. The air felt thicker. I couldn't pinpoint why, but something about the night had shifted. The walls, once familiar, now seemed like they were closing in. The creaking of floorboards came next, quiet at first, just a soft groan from somewhere below. I lay still, listening, waiting. The noise was no longer confined to the old house's groan. It was distinct, deliberate. A slow, methodical movement, like someone, or something, was pacing in the hallway. My heart began to race, and I felt the bed shift slightly. It was the tiniest movement, but it was enough. I sat up quickly, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my throat. My first instinct was to call out, to tell myself it was just the house settling. But my mouth went dry. My voice stuck in my throat. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, not to call anyone. There was no one to call, but to check the time again. Just to make sure this was real. That I wasn't imagining things. The clock read 2:45 a.m. now. The sound grew louder. It was unmistakable, a step, followed by another. Then another. Slowly, carefully, as if whatever was out there didn't want to make its presence known too soon. A shadow shifted beneath the door. I stared at it, eyes wide, breath held. I told myself, it's nothing. It's just the wind. The house is old. It's just the house. But my mind refused to let me believe it. I reached for the door handle, half expecting someone or something to burst through at any moment. My fingers were cold, trembling. I turned the knob slowly, just enough to peek through the crack. Nothing. The hallway was dark, but I could swear I saw movement, a slight shifting of shadows at the corner of my eye. The air felt cold now, unnaturally cold. I stepped out of my room, the floor creaking beneath my feet. Each sound seemed louder than the last, amplified by the silence surrounding it. The hallway stretched ahead of me, far longer than I remembered. The walls seemed to lean in, closing off my escape. I turned to the right, to the staircase that led to the basement, and froze. I had never been down there before. I'd seen the door, of course. It was an old wooden one, almost hidden in the corner, with a rusty handle that had never been touched. I had always assumed it was locked, or at least unused. But now, as I stared at it, it looked different. The shadows around the door seemed deeper, darker than before, like something was waiting on the other side. I took a step toward the stairs, my feet dragging as if the air itself was heavy, pulling at my legs. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but my body moved forward, almost against my will. Every fiber in me screamed to stop, but I couldn't. Something was urging me down there, something I couldn't explain. The silence grew unbearable as I reached the door. I grasped the cold handle and turned it. The door creaked open slowly, and the stench hit me immediately, a damp, earthy smell mixed with something bitter, something metallic. I could hear the faintest drip of water echoing from below. The basement was pitch black, a void, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I descended, each step a hollow thud beneath me. I was sure I wasn't alone. The floor was colder now, the air thick with the musty smell of decay. The silence in the basement was absolute, like it existed outside of time. I tried to move, to breathe normally, but my chest felt constricted, and my limbs felt stiff, like they were frozen in place. Then, I heard it again. The shuffle. But this time, it wasn't far away. It was right in front of me. I froze, my hand gripping the railing with a white-knuckled strength I didn't know I had. The shuffle was followed by a soft, wet-breathing sound. It was low, labored, almost like a person trying to stifle a cough. I squinted into the dark, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make out anything that could explain the noise. But there was nothing. Just the darkness. And the breathing. It came closer. My thoughts were racing. Should I run? Should I scream? But I was paralyzed. The silence, the weight of it, had me trapped. I couldn't even move to turn back. Then, a soft voice broke through the darkness, barely a whisper. It wasn't loud, but I felt it, deep in my chest. The words were garbled, like they were trying to speak through thick fog. "I'm here," it said. The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it felt as though it had rattled every bone in my body. I stood frozen, not daring to take another step. I was listening so intently, I felt my heart beating in my ears, thundering louder than the oppressive silence that surrounded me. The voice. It wasn't real. It can't be real, I told myself, over and over. But something inside me knew. The voice wasn't just in my head. It had a presence, like it was breathing alongside me, like it was right there in the room, watching. "I'm here," it repeated, this time clearer, but still muffled by something, like a thick layer of darkness wrapped around it. It was not a voice I recognized. Not a sound I had ever heard before. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to step down onto the next step of the basement stairs. The air grew colder the further I went, like a freezer had been opened in the depths of the house. Each breath I took burned in my chest, filling my lungs with a sharp, metallic scent, as though something in the air had soured over time. It was impossible to ignore. The shuffle was closer now. The breathing, too. It was low, erratic, like someone struggling to catch their breath, but there was something wrong with it, unnatural. It didn't sound like a person. Not anymore. I reached the bottom of the stairs and was plunged into complete darkness. I reached out, my hands trembling as I tried to find the light switch. My fingers brushed the wall, but I couldn't feel it. No switch, no outlet. Just the smooth, cold surface of the concrete. The smell in the air thickened, choking me. My pulse raced in my throat, and I realized with a sickening feeling that I had no way of knowing where I was. The basement, once so familiar, had turned into a void, an endless stretch of shadow and cold. The floor beneath my feet was sticky with something damp. I tried to move, but my feet felt stuck, like they were sinking into the ground. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Don't go." I spun around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My eyes strained against the dark, but I saw nothing. Just the looming outline of boxes and old furniture that seemed to twist and shift in the shadows. I couldn't focus. The fear was taking over, clouding my mind. Was this real? Was I imagining this? I wanted to run, but the stairs felt too far away. The space behind me felt too vast. Too empty. I was suffocating in it. The voice wasn't just a voice anymore. It was all around me, crawling under my skin, burrowing deep into my thoughts. I backed away slowly, my fingers brushing against something soft and damp. I gasped and spun around, expecting to find something in the dark. A figure, perhaps. But all I saw were more boxes, old tools, and the heavy, suffocating silence that hung like a curtain. But the breathing didn't stop. It was behind me now. Closer. My heart pounded, and I had no choice but to turn around again, my body tense, my mind racing. I couldn't tell if I was hearing things, or if something truly was there, something that shouldn't be. I opened my mouth to scream, but my throat felt dry. My voice, the very thing I needed to make this real, was gone. There's nothing here, it's just my mind playing tricks, that's what I tried to tell myself. But I could feel it now. The air around me had changed. It was alive. Suddenly, the shadows near the back wall seemed to thicken, swirling and stretching like a living thing. I blinked, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something emerge from the blackness, something pale and long, like fingers reaching toward me. It was moving. It was real. I stepped back, stumbling over something on the floor. My breath hitched in panic, my body freezing up. I couldn't look away. Whatever that thing was, it was closer now. Slowly. Steadily. And then, I saw it. A face, almost human, but wrong. Twisted. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the eyes were black, empty holes. No pupils, no color. Just darkness. A mouth opened, but there was no sound, only the horrific motion of its lipless smile, stretching wider and wider. I wanted to scream. I had to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My legs wouldn't move. And then it spoke again. You shouldn't have come down here. The voice was colder now, raspier, like it had been buried in the earth for too long. It echoed in my ears, vibrating in the walls. My body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of that voice. I didn't know how, but somehow my feet started moving. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I reached the first step, a cold hand grabbed my ankle, pulling me backward. I fell hard onto the basement floor, and the cold, damp fingers tightened around my leg. Panic surged through me. I kicked and screamed, but my body was paralyzed. The thing, whatever it was, dragged me toward the darkness. I felt my limbs weaken as it pulled me further into the void, my mind slipping into a haze of terror and confusion. Everything went black. I woke up on the cold basement floor, my breath shallow, my heart racing as if it hadn't slowed down since the moment I fell. For a moment, I thought it was a dream, a nightmare, that everything would return to normal if I just blinked hard enough. But the dampness on my skin, the bitter taste in my mouth, and the distinct smell of mildew told me otherwise. The shadows seemed to pulse around me, almost like they were alive. I had no idea how long I had been out, but when I pushed myself up, I felt dizzy, as if the world was spinning around me, too fast to catch. My body ached, and every part of me screamed to get out of that place. But I couldn't. Not yet. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, barely any light at all, but enough to make out the shapes around me. The boxes, the broken shelves, the old furniture, all of it seemed just like before. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing fear that seemed to tighten its grip on my chest. It's just a basement, I thought. Just a dark, old room. But the whispering voice still lingered in my ears, still pressing against my skull. You shouldn't have come down here. I clutched my head with both hands, trying to block it out, trying to make sense of the words. But they wouldn't stop. They were etched into my mind, vibrating like a low hum, wrapping around my thoughts like a cold, unshakable fog. I took a few shaky steps toward the stairs. The cold air seemed to thicken with each movement. The silence, too, was different now. It wasn't the comforting kind I remembered. It was heavy, suffocating, a silence that felt as though it was hiding something. A silence that was waiting. And that was why I saw it. At the base of the stairs, near the corner of the room, there was a shadow. Not a shadow cast by anything visible. No. It was moving, like it had a life of its own. And within it, I swore I could make out the shape of a figure, a tall, slender figure that seemed to bend in impossible ways, its arms stretching too far, its head tilting at an unnaturally sharp angle. I froze, my legs going weak beneath me. The figure was wrong. It didn't belong in that room. It shouldn't have been there. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. My body refused to cooperate. It was like I was glued to the floor, paralyzed by fear. And then, just as I thought it was going to move, just as I thought it was going to attack, the basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath hitched in my throat. The room plunged into an even deeper darkness, the shadows now all-consuming. The figure was gone. But I knew it was still there, somewhere, hiding in the corners of the room, watching. The air was so still, I couldn't even hear my own heartbeat. The silence pressed down on me with an unnatural weight. And then came the sounds. At first, it was a faint scratching, like nails on wood, almost too soft to hear. But then it grew louder. Closer. It was coming from the walls. No, it wasn't the walls. It was underneath the floor. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears, and I could feel the cold sweat creeping down my spine. The scratching, no, scraping, was getting louder, faster, like something was trying to break free from beneath the ground. Like something was alive. And then, I saw it again. In the corner of the room, near the furnace, a faint outline of movement. A figure, shifting, its limbs twisting in the shadows like something not entirely human. My throat tightened, and I knew with sickening certainty that it was the same thing that had pulled me earlier, the same thing that had whispered those terrifying words. But this time, it didn't speak. It didn't need to. The air around me seemed to hum with a low, guttural sound, something beyond human comprehension. A sound so wrong it felt like it was shaking the very foundation of my mind. And then, without warning, the floor beneath me creaked. I spun around, my eyes wide with panic, and that's when I saw it, on the wall, near the stairs. A handprint. But it wasn't just any handprint. This one was smeared, as if something, or someone, had dragged its fingers across the wall. It was large, too large for mine, and the fingers were twisted, as though the hand that had left it didn't belong to a person at all. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The silence was no longer just oppressive, it was alive. It was as if the very air in the basement had become part of the entity that was lurking there, waiting, watching. I wanted to scream again, but my throat was tight. My thoughts were fragmented, spinning out of control. How did I get here? I asked myself. Why did I come back? But no answers came, just the hollow scrape of something moving beneath the floorboards, the faint whispers that were growing louder, clearer. I'm here. I turned to face the corner, my heart racing. The figure was back, emerging from the shadows once more. It was taller than before, its features more distinct, though still horribly wrong. Its body was stretched and elongated, twisted at unnatural angles. It tilted its head to one side, and its black eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was stand there and watch as it slowly, deliberately, inched closer. And then, just as it reached out for me, its hand hovering above my shoulder, so close I could feel the cold radiating from it, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. The first thing I noticed when I regained consciousness was the overwhelming silence that filled the space. It wasn't the same silence I had felt before. No, this one was thick, almost suffocating, like it had substance. I could feel it pressing against my skin, invading my thoughts. My body was heavy, and my head ached as I struggled to open my eyes. For a long moment, I thought I was still dreaming, caught in some nightmarish state of half-sleep. But as my vision cleared, I realized this was no dream. I was back in the basement, sprawled across the cold, hard floor. The same broken shelves. The same boxes. The same darkness. Only this time, the room felt even more oppressive. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite name, an energy that didn't belong in this world. I pushed myself up, my legs shaky, and immediately noticed the unnatural quiet. There were no more whispers. No more scraping from beneath the floor. No more shadows moving in the corners. Yet I knew deep down that something was there, watching, waiting. It hadn't left. The basement was unchanged, yet everything felt different. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the ceiling appeared lower than before, as if the house itself was slowly shrinking. The temperature had dropped significantly, making my breath visible in the air. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. The floor creaked under my weight, a familiar sound that somehow seemed louder now, almost mocking me. I moved toward the stairs, but before I could take another step, something stopped me. A sound. Just a whisper at first, but it grew louder, like a muffled voice coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. There was nothing. Just the shadows. The same oppressive darkness that seemed to hang over everything. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Focus, I told myself. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind. The silence, it was wrong. I glanced at the door, but it remained shut, locked from the outside. I hadn't heard anyone come down here. No one had entered. But something was different. There was a faint sound now, like the scratching of nails on wood, close, very close. My eyes darted around, looking for the source of the noise. The walls? The floor? No. It was coming from above. I looked up, my pulse racing as I searched the ceiling, hoping that it wasn't what I feared it might be. And then, I saw it. A crack had appeared in the ceiling, a jagged line running across the drywall. It was small at first, almost imperceptible. But as I watched, it began to widen, slowly, deliberately, like something was pushing its way through. I could hear it now, the soft scratching, the sound of something alive, trying to break through. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat as the crack grew larger, revealing something. The shadows shifted again, swirling and twisting above me. I could feel the air grow colder, a sharp chill creeping down my spine. The ceiling groaned under the pressure of whatever was trying to break free. And then, with a sudden snap, the crack split open entirely, revealing a small, gaping hole. I froze. The shadows above me seemed to pulse, throbbing with a life of their own. Something was coming out. Something I wasn't meant to see. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me as I fell to the floor. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of it all. What was happening? What was that thing? And then, the voice, soft at first, barely a whisper, seemed to echo from all directions. It wasn't a human voice. No, this one was deeper, distorted, as if it was coming from somewhere far beyond reality. You can't escape. My heart skipped a beat as the words sank into my mind, twisting around my thoughts like a poisonous vine. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body refused to obey. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The silence had returned, but now it was different. It felt alive. I looked up again. The shadows were gone, but the hole in the ceiling remained. And from within it, I saw something shifting. A figure, or what seemed to be a figure, was moving, its form contorting, twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was too long, its limbs too thin, its body unnaturally elongated. The shape was barely visible, a blur against the dark background of the ceiling. I felt the pressure building in my chest, my heart hammering in my ribs. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the door was locked. The shadows, the strange presence in the room, they wouldn't let me go. "You can't leave," the voice repeated, growing louder now, more insistent. I shut my eyes, trying to block it out. But the words, the presence, it was everywhere. The very walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me with their oppressive weight. And then, suddenly, the silence was shattered. A loud bang echoed through the basement, so sudden and violent that it sent me scrambling to my feet. The figure in the ceiling was gone. The shadows had disappeared. The room was empty once again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the moment to strike. I took a step toward the door. This time, it opened. And as I stepped out of the basement, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence follow me, pressing down on me with every step. The house felt different. Like it was watching me, like it was alive. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get out. I left the basement behind me, but I knew that whatever had been in there, whatever had been waiting, it wasn't gone. It was still there, somewhere, waiting for me to return. And I had a feeling it would be waiting for a long, long time. Have you ever found something you weren't meant to? Something that seemed harmless at first, but later made you question everything you thought you knew? That's how it started for me, with an old closet tucked away in the attic. I thought I was just cleaning out some old junk. But when I opened that door, I found something that would haunt me forever. I had always been the kind of person who found comfort in routine. My family's house was old, built long before I was born, and filled with the weight of untold history. My parents were no longer around, and the house had passed into my hands after their sudden deaths, an event that left me grappling with an emptiness I couldn't fill. The place had a strange feeling about it, as though it were more than just walls and beams. There were times when I catch myself feeling watched, even when I was alone. But I chalked it up to grief or the natural creaks and groans of an old house. That day, I was sorting through the attic. The dust was thick, and the air smelled of mildew. The boxes were piled high, stacked on top of each other in a disorganized heap. Old furniture, faded photographs, and forgotten knickknacks filled every corner. As I was sifting through a stack of old magazines, I noticed something strange, an old, wooden door. It was hidden behind a shelf that seemed out of place, as if it had been deliberately pushed against it, maybe years ago. I paused. The door hadn't been there before. I had spent plenty of time in this attic, going through my parents' belongings, but I had never noticed this door. Curiosity got the best of me, and I reached for the handle. It creaked as I pulled it open, revealing a small room hidden behind the wall. My heart raced as I stepped inside, expecting more forgotten junk. But instead, the room was surprisingly tidy. There was a strange scent, like something stale, but also a bit sweet, almost sickly. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dusty old crates, boxes, and a few odd-looking objects that didn't belong in a normal house. I didn't know what to make of it. I had lived in this house for years, and yet this room was completely unknown to me. It was like stepping into a hidden piece of history, one that was never meant to be uncovered. But what stood out the most were the boxes. Each one was carefully labeled in faded handwriting. Most of them were dated, but some were marked with nothing more than a name. I walked over to one labeled simply, Mir. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing what seemed to be a collection of old documents and photographs. They were of people I didn't recognize, but there was something unsettling about them. The images were mostly black and white, faded with age. But it was the details that unnerved me. people in the photos had hollow expressions, their eyes too still, too lifeless. One photograph caught my attention. It was of a woman standing in front of the house, my house. But it was different. The yard was more overgrown, the windows were darker, and the house looked older. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the woman was staring directly into the camera, her face blank, but her eyes seemed to follow me. There was something deeply unsettling about her gaze. I closed the box and moved to another. This one was filled with more personal items, clothing, old letters, and a few trinkets. I sifted through the contents, my mind racing with questions. Who had lived here before us? And why did they leave so much behind? Then I found it. A small, delicate necklace. The pendant was a simple silver charm in the shape of an eye, its surface polished to a dull shine. It felt cold in my hand, almost too cold for such a small piece of jewelry. I stared at it for a long moment, the weight of the silence pressing in around me. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if I had just uncovered a part of the house's history that was never meant to be seen. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I was about to close the last box when a strange sound interrupted the silence, a faint rustling, as if something was moving behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. Just the shadows, creeping along the walls. I stood there for a moment, frozen, before quickly backing out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood in the attic, breathing heavily, unsure of what I had just experienced. Had I really heard something? Or had my mind simply played tricks on me? But the weight of the discovery, of those photographs, of the necklace, lingered. The feeling that I had uncovered something dangerous, something that should have been left buried, wouldn't leave me. And as I turned to leave the attic, I noticed something else. The door I had opened, the one leading to the hidden room, had been left slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. I should have locked the door. That thought kept circling in my head as I descended from the attic, the image of that slightly ajar door burning into my mind. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe I had just forgotten to close it properly. Maybe it had shifted on its own. But the nagging feeling remained. Something wasn't right. I sat at the kitchen table, the room feeling colder than usual. The house seemed to grow quieter with every passing minute. Every creak of the floorboards felt too loud, every shadow too deep. The necklace, the one with the eye pendant, lay on the table in front of me. I couldn't help but stare at it. There was something hypnotic about it, like it was watching me, always watching. The photos I found in the attic weren't helping either. I couldn't shake the image of the woman staring into the camera, her empty eyes frozen in time. Who was she? Why was her image hidden in a box marked with my family's name? I needed answers. But part of me was afraid of what I might find. I couldn't even explain why I felt this way, but the unease inside me had been growing, bubbling under the surface. It was like there was something about the house, about the past, that I wasn't meant to uncover. I picked up the necklace, feeling its cold surface against my fingers. It wasn't heavy, but it felt weighted, as if it held some kind of knowledge, some hidden truth I wasn't ready for. My gaze shifted to the clock on the wall. It was already late. Too late to be going back into the attic, too late to be digging into things that should have stayed buried. But I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. I stood up and walked toward the door, my mind set on revisiting the attic. But as I passed the hallway, I stopped. A noise, soft but distinct, came from above. It wasn't a creak this time, or a shuffle of the wind. No, it was a voice. A whisper. So faint I wasn't sure if I had heard it at all. I froze. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling, though I wasn't sure why. The house was empty. There was no one else here. I listened, straining my ears, but the whisper was gone. Only silence answered. For a moment, I considered going upstairs. But something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heartbeat quickened as I glanced up at the stairs. The dim light above barely illuminated the top, where the attic door stood, now closed. The door was locked. I hadn't locked it. I couldn't have. I'd never gone back upstairs after I left the attic earlier. A chill ran through me. I ran my hand through my hair, trying to steady myself. My mind was playing tricks on me. That's all it was. I turned back to the table, my eyes landing on the photograph of a woman. It felt like the air around me thickened with every glance. I was gripped by an irrational compulsion to go back up to that attic, to open the door, to find out who she was. But as I reached for the door handle, another sound stopped me in my tracks. A faint scraping, like nails against wood, coming from the direction of the attic. I let out a sharp breath, my hand frozen on the knob. This time, the noise wasn't a whisper. It was a deliberate sound, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention, trying to make itself known. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening? I glanced at the clock again. The hands had stopped. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. The second hand, which had been ticking relentlessly only moments ago, had come to a standstill. There was something deeply wrong with this house. Something I couldn't explain, no matter how hard I tried. I had to know the truth, even if I wasn't ready for it. Swallowing hard, I grabbed the key from the kitchen drawer. With a deep breath, I turned toward the stairs. My footsteps creaked against the wooden stairs as I made my way up, each step echoing in the silence that seemed to hang thicker with every inch I climbed. The house felt wrong. Not in the way a house might feel when it's old and tired, but in a way that pressed against the edges of my mind, making me question everything around me. The attic door stood at the top of the stairs, now looking far more menacing than it had earlier. The pale light above did little to dispel the shadows that gathered around the edges of the room. I had the key clutched tightly in my hand, and yet it felt heavy, as if the metal itself was weighing me down, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. Not after everything I'd already discovered. I inserted the key into the lock, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The door swung open with a groan, and I hesitated on the threshold. The smell hit me first, dust, old wood, and something else. Something metallic. I couldn't place it, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The attic was still the same as when I had left it earlier, except now it felt alive. As if it was watching me. The boxes were exactly where I had left them, the chest untouched. The same photographs were scattered across the dusty floor. But there was a new addition, a small piece of furniture against the far wall that I hadn't seen before. A chair. It looked old. Too old. The wood was dark and worn, the seat upholstered in faded fabric, its edges frayed as though it had been sitting here for years, forgotten by time. But it wasn't the chair that unsettled me. It was the small bundle of clothes that lay on it. At first, I thought it was nothing more than a forgotten blanket or discarded clothing. But as I approached, the details became clearer. a pair of shoes, a yellowed, torn dress, and a small, black book resting on top of the pile. The same book. I recognized the cover immediately. It was the same one I had seen earlier in the photo album. The book from the attic. I could feel my breath quicken, my pulse starting to race again as I reached down to pick it up. The pages were yellowed, brittle, and the weight of it felt wrong, too heavy, like it carried something more than just ink and paper. The silence in the room deepened as I flipped through the pages. There was nothing unusual about the first few pages, just neat, handwritten entries, mostly in faded ink. Names. Dates. Some addresses. But then, as I turned the pages further, something caught my eye. The handwriting became more erratic, the ink smudged in places as though the writer had been hurried or distressed. And then I found it. The final entry, the last page before the back cover. It was written in large, jagged letters, the ink bled with something dark, something that wasn't just ink. They're coming for me. I hear them. They know. Please, don't open the vault. It's already too late. Please, don't open it. The words struck me like a punch to the gut. A cold chill spread down my spine, and I dropped the book as though it had burned me. I had to leave. I had to leave right now. But before I could turn and flee, I heard it again. That soft scraping sound, almost like something dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate, coming from the back of the attic. I spun around, my heart racing. Nothing. The attic was empty, save for the old furniture, the boxes, the photos, and me. But the sound persisted, growing louder, sharper. I wasn't alone. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as the noise increased. There was no way out. No way to run. My mind raced. I was in the attic. I was standing in front of the thing I should have never touched, never opened. The vault. I hadn't seen it at first, not until now. The wall behind the chair had shifted, revealing a small, hidden door. It was too late to turn back. I reached out with shaking hands and pulled on the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, darkened space behind it. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer. I could barely make out the outline of something inside, something wrapped in old, tattered cloth. I took a deep breath and reached inside, my fingers trembling as I pulled the cloth away. And then I saw it. A small, wooden box. Nothing unusual about it at first glance. But there was a carving on the lid. A symbol I didn't recognize. It was intricate, delicate, and old. As I ran my fingers over the carving, the air in the attic grew colder, and I felt a presence, something dark, pressing in from all sides. My mind screamed at me to stop, to leave, but I couldn't. I opened the box. Inside, nestled in layers of old fabric, was a small, delicate object. A necklace. The same I pended. The one I had found earlier on the kitchen table. I dropped the box, my heart pounding in my chest as the room seemed to spin around me. The whispers started again, louder now, all around me. And then, just as I was about to scream, I heard it. A voice, soft and clear, whispering right into my ear. It's too late. The whisper echoed in my mind, leaving me paralyzed, frozen in place. My body felt like it was made of stone, every muscle rigid with fear. The voice was soft, too soft, but it carried with it an unmistakable weight, as though it were not a mere sound, but a presence that had always been there, watching, waiting. It's too late. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet refused to move. I was rooted to the floor, the weight of the necklace in my hand making it seem like the room was pressing in on me, suffocating me. And then, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence I had known before. No, this was something thicker, heavier, as though the house itself had taken a deep breath and was now holding it, waiting for something. I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to leave. I had to get out of this cursed attic, out of this house that had been hiding so many secrets. But as I turned to run, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound so sudden and forceful that it echoed through my bones. I spun around, panic flooding my chest. The attic, which had seemed so familiar just moments ago, now felt alien, hostile. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. The box on the floor, the necklace still inside it, was the only thing that seemed unchanged. But I knew now that I couldn't leave without understanding. I had to know what this all meant. The whispers had stopped, but the air in the attic felt charged with something I couldn't explain. It was like the room itself was waiting, listening. I slowly walked back to the box, my fingers shaking as I reached out and picked it up again. The necklace inside still gleamed with an eerie light, but it wasn't just the necklace that caught my attention. It was the symbols on the box, symbols I now recognized from the pages of the old book I had found earlier. They weren't just random carvings. They were part of something. Something old. Something dangerous. I felt the weight of those words, the words that had been scribbled in a book, "Don't open it." But it was too late. I had opened it. And now, there was no going back. As I held the necklace in my hand, the room seemed to shift. The light from the window flickered, casting shadows across the floor. It was as though something was moving in the corners of the attic, something that I couldn't quite see but could feel creeping closer. My breath quickened, and I had to force myself to stay still, to keep my hands from trembling. I stared down at the necklace, trying to focus on its intricate design. The pendant itself was an eye, an unblinking, all-seeing eye that seemed to watch me no matter where I turned. It was beautiful, in a way, but there was something so wrong about it that I couldn't bear to look at it for too long. As I held the necklace, I felt the strangest sensation, a tug, almost as if it was pulling me, urging me to do something. I didn't understand it at first, but then the realization hit me. The necklace wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a key to something hidden, to something locked away for far too long. And then, without warning, the floor beneath me groaned, and the attic door that had slammed shut earlier creaked open once more, a thin sliver of light pouring through the gap. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me on the other side. But I couldn't resist. I stepped toward the door, the necklace still clutched tightly in my hand. The hallway beyond was eerily silent, the shadows stretched long and thin. I could feel the eyes of the house on me, as though it were alive, watching my every move. My heart was racing in my chest as I took a step forward. And then I saw it. The photograph. The same one from the album. The same figure, the one who had been watching me from the pages of that old, dusty book. It was hanging on the wall at the far end of the hallway. The figure was staring directly at me, a strange, unreadable expression on its face. I could see the faintest glint of the necklace around the figure's neck, identical to the one I was holding. I approached the photograph, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The figure in the photo wasn't just someone from the past. It was connected to me. Somehow, I had become a part of this story. The story I was unraveling. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized that there were things here, things that weren't meant to be discovered. With a shaky breath, I turned the photograph over, and there it was, a name. A name written in dark, bold letters. The same name that had appeared in the book. Lillian Forsythe. I felt my stomach drop. The name rang in my mind like an echo. It was a name I should have recognized, a name that should have meant something. But I couldn't place it. Not until now. The whispers started again. Louder this time. They came from all around me, and I could feel them tightening their grip on my thoughts, on my mind. I had to get away. I had to get out before it was too late. But the house wouldn't let me leave. The door behind me slammed shut once more, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, moving closer. I turned back to the photograph. Lillian Forsythe. The truth was close now. Closer than I wanted it to be. But as I stared at the name, I heard the whisper again. Lillian is waiting. The words Lillian is waiting echoed through my mind like a drumbeat, reverberating in my skull. I stood frozen in place, staring at the photograph. The face in the picture wasn't just staring at me anymore, it felt as though it was alive, watching, waiting. A sharp, unsettling sensation crawled up my spine, and I instinctively stepped back, bumping into the cold wooden wall behind me. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, cutting through the heavy silence. The hallway seemed to stretch longer, the darkness in the corners feeling denser, more suffocating. Lillian Forsythe. The name lingered in the air, familiar but distant, like an uninvited memory that refused to surface fully. It was tied to this house, to the vault in the attic, to whatever was buried deep within these walls. There had to be a connection. I couldn't leave. The house wouldn't let me. That much was clear. Every door, every window, seemed to be sealed shut. Trapped. As I tried to steady my racing thoughts, the whispers returned. They were no longer soft and distant, now they were everywhere, filling the room, surrounding me. They came from the very walls, the floor beneath me, the dark shadows that clung to the edges of the hallway. But still, I couldn't make out their words. Only fragments of sound, like a broken puzzle, taunting me with their elusive meaning. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, where the light from the hallway met the darkness, something shifted. A figure. A woman, standing perfectly still, her silhouette almost blending with the shadows. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the shadows danced in the corners of my mind. But no! It was real. It was her. Lillian Forsythe. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her features were obscured, like the darkness itself was trying to consume her, but there was a faint glow to her, an ethereal quality, like a ghost caught between worlds. My heart skipped a beat, my throat tightening with fear. I took a step forward, my legs shaking beneath me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. I was drawn to her, as if some invisible force was pulling me toward her. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling became. A cold, icy chill wrapped around my body, and my breath turned to mist in the air. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, as if they were urging me to reach her, to understand her. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to know anymore. What was I even searching for? What was I expecting to find? I reached out, my hand trembling as I moved toward the figure. But before I could touch her, the air in front of me shifted. The temperature dropped drastically, and the faint glow from her form dimmed until there was nothing but the heavy darkness once again. The whispers ceased, and the silence was deafening. But then, from the depths of the silence, a voice, clear and distinct, spoke. "You should never have come here." The voice was cold, detached, and so full of ancient sorrow that it sent a jolt of terror through me. I knew it wasn't Lillian speaking. This was something else. Something far darker. Something that had been waiting, watching, just as I had been. I tried to speak, to ask who it was, but my voice caught in my throat, trapped by an unseen force. My body froze, and my eyes darted around the hallway, desperate for a way out, for something to change. And then, the temperature dropped even further. The air grew thick with a suffocating presence, as if something was pressing down on me, drowning me in its weight. The shadows seemed to move, inching closer, wrapping around me like a vice. I could feel the walls closing in, the space shrinking until there was no room to breathe. I turned back toward the photograph, hoping to find some kind of answer there, but the image had changed. The figure, Lillian Forsythe, was no longer standing still. She was moving, slowly, her eyes now fixed directly on me. Her mouth was slightly open, but no sound came from her. Then, with an unnatural fluidity, her hand extended toward the photo frame, reaching out, as if inviting me to touch it. I felt a surge of panic, my heart hammering in my chest. This was it. The moment of truth. I had to make a choice. Touch the frame and uncover the hidden past, or run and leave it all behind. But deep down, I knew that escaping wasn't an option anymore. Lillian wasn't just a ghost, a mere memory. She was a part of the house. Part of the curse that had been buried for so long. And now, I was a part of it too. With a final, shaky breath, I stepped forward, reaching for the frame. As my fingers brushed the cold surface, the entire house seemed to tremble. A violent force pulsed through the walls, and the world around me began to distort. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and the very fabric of reality seemed to warp. Then, I heard her voice again, this time clearer, more direct. "You shouldn't have touched it." The ground beneath me gave way. I fell into darkness. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.